Welcome back to the Very Good Gardening Podcast. I'm Kristen McCoy, and today we're going to talk about one of my favorite parts of the garden, and honestly, one of the most useful parts of the garden as well: herbs. Herbs are one of those things that feel small, but they can completely change the way that you cook and how confident you feel in the garden. You don't need a whole lot of space, you don't need fancy equipment, and you don't need to be an expert to grow them well. Herbs can grow in the ground, in raised beds, in pots on your porch, or even in a sunny window. And that's why herbs are one of those things that you can grow all year long. I think herbs are also where a lot of people start to use what they grow from their garden. You might harvest tomatoes once a week, maybe peppers twice a month, but herbs you can continuously harvest throughout the season, and you feel a lot of success from that. And the best part is that you can sneak those herbs into just about every aspect of your cooking. Today, I want to walk you through how I think about herbs in my garden. We'll talk about perennial versus annual herbs, how I start them from seed, how I preserve them so nothing goes to waste, and how I actually use herbs in my cooking on a daily basis. I'll talk about basil specifically because basil deserves its own moment, and we'll get into mint, pollinators, and how I use some flowers as herbs as well. And just a quick reminder, if you really like garden to table content and using what you grow, I do have my full step-by-step recipes over on Bonus View. And if you're looking for gardening merch or ways to support my work, you can find everything over on my Fourth Wall shop. Both are always going to be linked for you. Whether you're brand new to gardening or you grow a lot of your food, herbs are a great way to get the most out of your garden. And I'm really excited to dig into it. Let's talk about why herbs deserve a dedicated spot in your garden and why you can kind of fit them in your other spaces too. I look at herbs as a high value item in my garden. Not only do herbs cost a ton of money in the store for how much you get, but they also have a fantastic flavor that you can incorporate in all of your cooking. Just adding a little bit of these herbs to your cooking can go a long way. And what's really cool is with most herbs, the more that you harvest, the more that the plant will grow. So that means the greedier you are, the more that you'll get. I look at herbs as kind of like a bridge to everyday cooking. And herbs are one of those things that I use in my cooking every single day. So I'm constantly reminded of all of the different things that I grew in my garden. When I first started gardening, I just had a deck and I had to do container gardening. And I started with just one box. Now, the box was about as big as this table, so it was not a small box, but I found so much success in just growing those herbs in that one box. And so that was a really great confidence booster for me, and it encouraged me to try other things. From there, I started growing strawberries in containers, and then I tried little mini dwarf tomatoes, and then I went from there. I was never able to grow a whole bunch on my deck, but I do remember thinking I'm always going to have herbs in my garden. I'm not sure if you can hear, but today is a super windy day. It actually snowed about an inch or two last night, and the wind is swirling that snow around. So if you're hearing that wind in the background, that's what that is, and I can't do anything about it. And what's great is that even though I am somebody who has been gardening for a very long time, I still incorporate herbs into my garden because not only do I see the value in my cooking, but also I see there's a ton of value in my garden itself. So let's talk about what herbs are in my garden. I have a ton of perennial herbs, and sometimes they make it, sometimes they don't, because I am in zone 7B and a lot of herbs are right on the cusp. A lot of herbs need either colder weather or warmer weather in order to become a perennial. Lavender is one of those that's right on the edge, but my lavender does come back every year. Chives, rosemary, sage, oregano, all of those are also perennials. I have tried to grow bay laurel in my garden several years in a row, but even though it says that it should be a perennial in my zone, it doesn't usually survive. So I'm going to try and grow it again this year, and I'm going to put it in a pot so that I can take that pot inside. Hopefully, it will survive in my greenhouse over the winter if we don't have this super cold streak like we did this year. Thyme and mint are other perennials that you do have to watch out for, especially anything in the mint family. These perennial herbs tend to spread quite aggressively, and they will take over your garden if you're not careful. A lot of people have probably seen my troubles with chocolate mint. I actually had this in a container. I knew that it spread like crazy, and I had no idea that it would do this. But it was in a container up on a plant stand. So it was probably 2.5, 3 feet off of the ground. And it was in a pot and it grew out and over and traveled down. But what I think also might have happened is I think it went to seed. I think it flowered and I think the seed spread onto the ground. Well, it was game over from then. I have had that chocolate mint underneath the fence in my raspberry bushes for the last 4, maybe even 5 years. It will not go away. I'm actually really curious to see how much mint I have because towards the end of the season, I actually forgot to make sure to pick it out. And so I have a feeling that it may have gone a little too wild. But I'm going to definitely make sure that when I am pruning my raspberries that I'm taking out as much mint as I can see. So mint goes in a pot, mint goes in a pot, and make sure that it doesn't flower and spread seeds all over your soil. A great thing about all of those perennials is that I can usually rely on them to pop up in my garden every single year. Now, because we're on the cusp, some of those I like to grow from seed every year just in case they don't pop up like I'd like them to. Like thyme and savory and rosemary, I use those so much that I don't want to depend on them coming back up next year. So I will grow them from seed again just to make sure that I actually have that supply. And then sometimes if I don't need them, I'll give away those plants or seedlings. Now let's get into the annual herbs. These are herbs that are definitely not going to survive through the winter, and I will have to replant each year. Now, some of these will reseed themselves, like the cilantro, sometimes the basil, especially the cinnamon and the lemon basil. They tend to be a little more aggressive with the reseeding, but I don't depend on that at all. And I want to make sure that I have those herbs in the correct spots. So I always start them from seed. Those annuals are going to include parsley, even though that's technically a biennial, I grow it each year. So parsley, basil, cilantro, dill, stevia. Stevia is another one of those that it might come back if I was in the right zone, but I'm going to grow it from seed each year because that was one of the cooler things that I grew in my garden. If you're not familiar with stevia, you can take the leaves, dry them, and then ground them up and use it as a natural sweetener. So I like to dry out my mint, I use that as a tea, and then I use my stevia, and then my entire cup of tea was homegrown. So cool. So cool. I highly recommend growing stevia. With herbs like dill and cilantro, you want to make sure that you are succession planting those so that you're not getting a huge amount of harvest in the beginning of the season and then none for the rest of the season. Now let's talk about how I start all of these herbs. Last year, I started every single herb and ended up not getting very many of them. My greenhouse got way too hot and I didn't realize that, and it basically cooked all of my seedlings. I was very disappointed. However, my local nursery, Frank's, had everything that I needed, so I obviously ended up spending more money, but I didn't go without any of those herbs. This year, I have learned from that mistake and I plan on making sure that I am regulating the temperatures inside my greenhouse. But I do try to grow almost everything from seed. However, certain things like cilantro, sometimes I just can't grow it in the middle of the summer. Cilantro bolts very quickly, and so I will usually get a lot of cilantro in the beginning, like late spring, early summer, and then again in the fall. But I like to eat cilantro all summer long, so sometimes I'll just buy cilantro starts because I am not seed starting in the middle of the summer. I am so busy that that's just not something that I know that I'm capable of doing, so I don't mind buying some extra cilantro. And I say all of this because I am an experienced gardener and I do grow almost everything from seed. But I'm saying all of this to give you permission to buy some things as starts. Honestly, if you want to buy everything as starts, that's totally okay. Don't make anyone make you feel less than because you didn't start everything from seed. You are still a gardener if you're buying starts from the nursery. I don't think twice about it, and neither should you. Certain things that I do recommend that you buy as starts if you're a brand new gardener would be all of those perennial herbs that I mentioned. Some of them can be very stubborn to start as seed, especially anything in the mint family. What's funny about the mint family is that they are really hard to germinate and hard to get going as plants. But then once they are those plants, it's almost impossible to get rid of them. Yes, starting your herbs from seed will save you money. So, if you are able to start those from seeds and you want to give that a try, I do recommend that you do that. However, it can feel a little overwhelming and frustrating when those herbs don't germinate quite as fast as you were hoping. And keep in mind that most of those seeds are going to be teeny tiny, smaller than a poppy seed. And that can be really intimidating. Oregano is so small. In one popcorn kernel, I bet you could fit 4,000 seeds easily. That's just my guess. I don't really know, but they are teeny tiny and it can be really intimidating. However, if there's one herb that you should absolutely try to grow from seed, that would be basil. There are 3 reasons, in my opinion, why I think you should start basil from seed. One is that you'll have a ton more basil than you can imagine, and you can grow different varieties more so than you could probably buy in the store. Number 2, it's going to save you a lot of money and it's easy to grow. But number 3 is a silly reason. I want you to experience what basil looks like right before it germinates. You're going to put the seeds on top of the soil and you're going to make sure that that soil is nice and damp. Within hours, those basil seeds will plump up and it will look like little balls of slime. I'm going to be completely transparent. I just looked up what it's called when the basil, it gets all slimy and little balls, and it's called mucilage. That's a word. It's not a great word, but that's what it's called. It's called mucilage. I'm probably not pronouncing it right, and that's okay. But they are so unique in that way. I want you to experience that as a gardener because the first time I ever saw it, I freaked out a little bit. I did a whole bunch of research, realized it was normal. I actually thought it was mold, but it was one of those things like, oh, that's just what basil does. I use basil in my cooking all the time. I do like to make sure that I have enough that I dry, but I also make sure that I have buckets and buckets of basil to make pesto. Pesto is a staple in my family, so we make sure that we have pesto at least once a week. I have enough in my freezer right now that I could have pesto for the next 10 days if I wanted to. But then we wouldn't have any more until I can grow basil again. Now, I only use a certain kind of basil for my pesto, and that's going to be Genovese or it's going to be Everleaf. I also found this basil called Momolo, and Momolo was huge, and I found it to be a little bit tastier than Genovese basil. But I can't find Momolo basil anymore, so I just stick with Genovese. And then Everleaf is really awesome because it does not bolt the entire season. It never goes to flower. So I am constantly harvesting up until the first frost. However, there is a drawback for that because pollinators love basil flowers. It doesn't matter what variety of basil it is, you need to make sure that you have at least a dozen basil plants in your garden that you let flower. You won't regret it. Those pollinators will be all over it, and then they can head on over to the vegetables that are right next door and they'll be able to pollinate your garden. Bumblebees, I love watching bumblebees on basil flowers because it's a lot of little flowers that are close together. So they'll just go one flower to the next. I love lemon basil. It's not as strong as lemon balm, but it does have a very nice lemon flavor that I like to use in salad dressings. I'll chop it up really fine and I'll add some lemon, olive oil, vinegar, sweetness, little honey or sugar, and it tastes like a lemony salad dressing. I also like to do that for cinnamon basil. Now, cinnamon basil is really cool because sometimes, depending on the variety of cinnamon basil, it can flower just like every other type of basil. And then sometimes it'll have big clumps of flowers right in the middle, and it is gorgeous. I actually grew a whole bunch of flowers for my brother's wedding, and they used cinnamon basil in the flower bouquets. It was one of the cooler things for me to be able to contribute to my brother's wedding, but it was also gorgeous. Cinnamon basil will always be in my garden because of that. It's useful and also beautiful, and it brings in those pollinators. The last kind of basil I'll talk about is purple basil. Now, there are many, many different varieties of purple basil, but I really like the ones that are dark, like dark opal. For me, the purple basil has a richer flavor, and I like to use that with caprese salad. Not only does it add more color to the caprese salad, but I just find that it goes really, really well with the tomato and the cheese and the olive oil. It just is a perfect blend. Sometimes I will use purple basil to make pesto just to spice it up a little bit. Harvesting basil frequently has the same effect as many other herbs where it will keep producing more. However, with basil, you want to harvest it a very specific way so that it can bush out and not get taller. The way I like to look at it is I will harvest basil by the stem. I'll look at the bottom of the stem and then I will count 3 junctions. That's where the leaves are going to meet the stem. And I'll count those 3 junctions, and above that 3rd junction, that's when I will cut the entire stem off. By harvesting basil this way, it will allow those junctions to actually branch out on 2 different sides, making it much more of a bush instead of a tall plant. That's how I always harvest my basil, and I recommend that you do the same. Now let's talk about the mint family. I'm sure there are plenty of things in the mint family that you're already familiar with, like spearmint and peppermint and all the other kinds of mints, chocolate, orange, pineapple, apple, all of those are in my garden and I love them. But I'm not sure if you're aware that there are other herbs that are also in the mint family. Herbs like oregano, lemon balm, and perilla leaves will all act the exact same way as mint, which means they all belong in pots. Do not plant them in a raised bed or in ground. They go in pots. I was just introduced to perilla leaves by a friend of mine, and I cannot wait to try that in my cooking. However, I looked it up, and I'm so glad I did before putting it in my raised bed, and I found out it was in the mint family, and I was like, nope, it goes in a pot in my garden, but I'm gonna watch it very closely. Bee balm is also in the mint family, so be careful with that. But I do recommend having bee balm somewhere in your garden because it does attract those bees and it's beautiful. Now, I use all of those mints in different ways, but mostly I love to make tea. So I'll use the apple mint with my chamomile to make chamomile tea. It's just a softer mint and it goes well with the chamomile. However, chocolate mint is much stronger, so that just becomes a tea all on its own. Strawberry mint I like to use to make strawberry adult drinks or maybe even a mocktail, but it really goes well with strawberry. And I get this question all the time. Do the mints actually taste like the fruit or the flavor that they are named after? In the case of chocolate mint, that's absolutely the case. And actually, I think strawberry mint has a very slight taste of strawberry, but maybe it's just all in my head. But there is a mint called cat mint, and no, it does not taste like cat. I don't know how I know that, but I'm pretty sure I know that. Cat mint is also one of those softer mints, so I'll actually use that in ice cubes. I'll put them in ice cube trays, freeze them with water overnight, and then I'll add it to my water the next day, and they're perfect, very refreshing. I also like to do that with lemon balm. By the way, lemon balm tea is incredible. I highly recommend that. I know that it's not ideal to let mint flower, but if you do, just make sure that those flowers are contained within that pot. I do want to say that the bees love flowered mint, so that is definitely a benefit. Just don't let the seeds from the flowers get into your walkways or into your soil because that's when disaster will strike. I did mention chamomile, so let's go into two flowers that I use as herbs. One, obviously, being chamomile. Those teeny tiny little daisy like flowers, I just pop them right off of the plant. The more that you harvest, the more it will come back. I let them dry and then I use that as my chamomile tea. It is so cool. It tastes just like you would buy in the store, but it's way fresher, and I just love knowing that I actually grew it. Drying chamomile is actually really easy. I just get a paper towel and I put the little flowers on top and I let them dry. It usually takes about 3 days, but after that, I put them in a little jar and I'm good to go. The other flower that I like to use as an herb is calendula. Now, calendula has a couple of different uses, but I know that I like to use calendula along with sage if ever I have a sore throat. Now, I am not giving medical advice at all, but I tend to get that itchy allergy throat every once in a while. And so I'll put dried sage and dried calendula into a teapot, and I find that that really soothes it. I can also make calendula into an oil or a balm, like a lip balm, and it is not only very flavorful, but it also is very soothing. And it's really pretty too. It has many different colors that it comes in, but it's also really fragrant. And once again, the pollinators love it. If you ever decide to grow calendula from seed, the seed shapes are like little horns. They are actually really cool. I recommend doing that and getting different varieties because, again, it comes in many different colors. It's beautiful. Now let's talk about how I use those herbs in my cooking. First of all, who does not have dried herbs in their pantry right now? I think everybody has at least oregano or thyme or rosemary in their pantries. I don't need to buy that from the store anymore. I get it straight from my garden. I use the oregano all the time because I like to make a lot of pizza or spaghetti sauce, and I'll just sprinkle a little extra on top. And basil, I love to use in my cooking as well. I like to do that with sauces and also add a little bit into my bread dipping oil. I'll do that with rosemary and oregano as well. I like to have dried parsley on hand as well. I use that more than I thought I would. And dried cilantro comes in handy every once in a while as well when I'm using or making Indian dishes. I am not an expert on Indian cooking. However, the couple of times that I have started to dabble in Indian cooking, I have found that a lot of times they like to use dried cilantro, and that's been so cool to have it right there on hand. I've also given away little jars of herbs to family and friends during the holidays because, again, who doesn't want those? Oh, I add rosemary in my bread all the time, like my sourdough. It's very, very, very flavorful when it's dried like that. I have found that rosemary is much more flavorful as a dried version than a fresh version. So I use those back and forth. I actually think that I might have some fresh rosemary in my garden underneath 6 inches of snow right now. It's very hardy. It's pretty cool. Oh, I also use tarragon in tarragon chicken. That is a perennial that has come back every year. I like to use chives in potatoes or sour cream, anything that wants to add a little extra onion flavor. But I bet you could find a use for all of your herbs in your garden if you really tried. But it's really not hard to just incorporate herbs in your cooking. Every herb you add is just going to make it better. All right, beginners, let's talk really quick about the couple of herbs that you would like to grow. First, think about your specific cooking and what you would like to add to it. If you look in your pantry and you see a whole bunch of herbs that you'd like to replace in your actual garden, normally I would say, hey, start with 3 or 4. But you know what? With herbs, I find that the more the better. It's okay to start out with all of them if you want to. Because the best thing about herbs is that usually the plants are small enough that you can plant them in between your annual vegetables, especially tomatoes. Plant those basil plants in between your tomatoes and your tomatoes will be much happier for it. Plant that calendula near your beans and your watermelon plants and that'll bring in the pollinators. Plant your chamomile next to your strawberries. I know that most people say to start with a few favorites, but I think that it might be best to just start however many you want. You'll learn a lot in that way. I don't think this is the same situation as maybe peppers and tomatoes where I'm like, hey, grow all of the varieties you want to grow. You can totally do that, but for beginners, that is going to be extremely overwhelming. But herbs are different. You can plant them and forget them. Remember though, the more you harvest, the more they'll grow. But a lot of those herbs, especially the perennials like thyme and rosemary and lavender, they don't really need all that much water. In fact, they can be overwatered pretty easily. So they're very beginner friendly type of plants. And basil can grow so much that you really only need 1 or 2 plants, although I recommend a lot more, that you can feel success with that. And herbs don't need to be perfect. You don't need to be a perfect gardener in order to grow herbs. I do think that they are the most beginner friendly of any kind of plant in your garden. Herbs are one of those things where they quietly change the way that you grow and the way that you cook. They don't demand a lot, but they do give back constantly throughout the season. A few plants can stretch across an entire season, show up in your meals every single day, and even support the pollinators while they're at it. If you're a beginner or if you've ever felt overwhelmed by gardening, herbs are the perfect place to start. You don't need a big plan, you don't need a big space, you just need a couple of plants that you actually enjoy using. All of a sudden one day you'll be adding those herbs to sauces and you'll feel like a master gardener. If you want to see how I use herbs in my everyday cooking, all of my Harvest to Table recipes live on Bonus View. That's where you'll find all of my full recipes and seasonal cooking ideas. And if you want to support the podcast or get some really cute gardening merch, head on over to my Fourth Wall page. As always, grow what makes sense for your life, your kitchen, and the space that you have. Gardening should feel useful and joyful, not stressful. Thanks for spending this time today with me talking all about herbs, and until next time, I hope you grow something very good.